I flew here on a commercial plane. I would have preferred to fly here in my own private jet. Right? Why don't I have one? Is it because I don't want one? There's a lot of things I don't have. I don't have a 600-foot yacht with a helicopter and a submarine on it. I mean, I'd want one. Do I need the government to try to stimulate that desire? No. The reason I can't have one is because I can't afford it, because the prices for those goods are too high. So we need prices to come down. Well, how do prices come down? You know, more production, or I have to earn more. You know, the reason my 6-year-old child can consume things is because his father works. It's not the other way around. I don't work, you know, I don't work because he's consuming. He consumes because I work. But the government wants us to believe it's the other way. I mean, think about it. When the first plasma TV set came out, it cost about $10,000. And I saw one, and I wanted it. It was pretty cool. But I didn't buy it. Why did I eventually buy one? Because productivity increased so much that the price of those plasma TVs dropped to the point where I actually wanted one. I actually could afford one. It was increased productivity that created demand by lowering prices. And that's what's going to happen. You know, right now, and this is, I think, is a very important point to make, and I think it's one of the biggest things that people miss. And it's the same way that people, when I was talking about the real estate bubble in 2004 and 2005 and how prices were going to collapse, and people said that's impossible, that's never going to happen, and, you know, I explained the nature of the phony economy, and people didn't want to hear it. Something that's equally as ridiculous, but is also a commonly held belief by just about everybody who covers finance in the newspapers, every economist at every university, every major head of a major investment bank, anybody in government, they're all making the same mistake. They think that we've got the world over some kind of barrel, that we've got China over a barrel, that they have no choice, that they have to buy our debt forever, because if they stop lending us money, we won't buy their stuff. And they have to keep buying our bonds forever, because the minute they stop, they're going to take such a big loss on their current positions that they'll never stop, that they will throw good money after bad forever. That is just completely ridiculous. That is not going to happen. Nobody does that, right? I mean, companies go bankrupt because creditors come to their senses. If creditors just always extended loans to avoid having to write them down, then no one would ever go bankrupt. And of course, lending money, vendor financing, only works if you see hope of getting paid back. Having a position where you have to perpetually finance your customers makes no sense at all. The Chinese might as well just dump all their goods in the Pacific Ocean. I mean, what good is it sending them over here if all we give them is little pieces of paper? Now, I got in my wallet, somebody handed me a little piece of Zimbabwe paper. It has the word 10 trillion written on it. You know, where's the value there? What would happen if the Chinese stopped lending us money to China? What would happen? Would it be, oh my God, what are we going to do with all this stuff? We got all this furniture, we got all this consumer electronics, we got all these articles of clothing. What are we going to do with them? They're going to use them. Because what would happen the minute the Chinese stop buying our bonds, the dollar will collapse. The RMB will rise, effectively reducing the prices of everything China produces for Chinese consumers. And then they'll buy them, just like I bought that plasma TV. People think that Americans are somehow doing the world a favor because we're the only people that want stuff. The Chinese don't want anything. You got Chinese workers producing washing machines, and as they're working in these factories for 10 hours a day, for low wages, they're thinking to myself, gee, I'm glad I don't have one of these. I want to wash my clothes in the river, in the backyard, with a rock. No, they're thinking the same thing I was thinking about that plasma TV. Gee, I wish I could have one of these if I could only afford it. Well, why can't they afford it? Because the government is stealing all their purchasing power and giving it to us. The reality is the Chinese can afford it because they can make it. We're the ones that can't afford it because we're not making it. Now, the Chinese are going to figure this out. And they're also going to figure out the idea that, yes, they've bought $1 trillion worth of our bonds. There's no turning back. And, yeah, they can't sell them. But you know what? Sometimes you got to cut and run. Sometimes you got to take your losses and admit your mistakes. Because why make them bigger? Think about the size of our deficit right now. We're talking about close to a $2 trillion deficit, which I'm sure is going to be more, because they're already talking about a second stimulus, which really is a third stimulus, because the first one happened under Bush. And if the Chinese can do the math, because they're already buying something like 50% of our bonds, the Chinese say, wait a minute, if these guys are going to run a $2 trillion deficit, that means we're going to have to loan them another $1 trillion this year. And then what about next year and the year after that? Instead of worrying about how much they're going to lose on the bonds they already own, they're starting to worry about how much they're going to lose on the bonds that we're expecting them to buy. And those losses are horrific. Better to take a loss, even a big loss, on $1 trillion than take an even bigger loss on $5 trillion or $10 trillion. How long is it going to go? Right? We ought to know now. They have a painful example, or a clear example, that Ponzi schemes end. No matter how clever they are, no matter how long they've been operated, they always end, right? Look at Bernie Madoff. How long did Bernie Madoff keep that scam going, right? Did people lose money with Bernie Madoff 5 years ago? No. Was it a Ponzi scheme 5 years ago? Of course it was. But they didn't lose money because they hadn't figured it out. And when anybody wanted their money back, Bernie wrote them a check. Where did he get the money? From other people who didn't know it was a Ponzi scheme. The U.S. government does the same thing. We can't pay this money back, and everybody knows it. There's no way we can raise taxes and pay this debt off. All we can do is keep borrowing until the world comes to its senses and stops lending. And then we got to do the same thing as Bernie Madoff. We got to default. Although we have one option that Bernie didn't have. We got a printing press. And so we can pretend to pay it back and default through inflation. That's why I've joked, if, to really, keep this thing going, instead of having Bernie Madoff in jail, we ought to make him Secretary of the Treasury. But then it might be, I guess maybe it would be too obvious if we did that. But, so this is going to end. Just like lenders eventually stopped loaning money to people who couldn't pay it back, just like real estate prices didn't go on forever, this dynamic between between China or other countries for that matter too, and America will not go on forever. We're not going to continue to consume what other people produce, and we're not going to continue to borrow what other people save, especially since the borrowed money is going to consumption. When you borrow money to consume, you can't pay it back. How are you going to pay it back? You don't have an asset. Borrowing is for businesses. It's for entrepreneurs. It's to accumulate capital. Why? Number one, society benefits from that. But number two, when you borrow money and you get a capital asset, you can pay back the loan because the capital asset generates an income. The income pays back the debt. The income pays the interest. When you borrow money to spend it, what do you have? You got nothing. How are you going to pay it back? You just have to reduce your consumption in the future to pay for your indulgence in the present. We have to move away from that, but the world knows they're not going to, we can't pay it back. And so when this dynamic comes to an end, what's going to happen, right? When foreigners don't buy our bonds, bond prices collapse. When they no longer buy the dollar collapses. And then what's going to happen, right? The Federal Reserve is going to be in a real pickle. And when I talk about hyperinflation and the possibility of hyperinflation, it's not based on current monetary policy. Current monetary policy is just going to give us high inflation. It's probably not going to give us Zimbabwe-style inflation. In order to get that type of inflation, the Federal Reserve is going to have to continue to make the same mistakes, and the government is going to have to continue to make the same mistakes that they're making now. If they do, then that's what we're going to have. And the key timing is going to be when the foreign demand stops, is the Federal Reserve going to buy the bonds? Or are they going to do what Ben Bernanke is bluffing that he's going to do, in my opinion, and that is mop up all that excess liquidity, right? Put that genie back in her bottle. And how would they do that? Well, what the Federal Reserve is going to have to do is refuse to buy those bonds, which means bond prices will collapse because there will be no buyers until prices collapse sufficiently to produce an interest rate high enough to attract real buyers. Who knows how high that rate might be? In 1980, rates got to 20%. Imagine if something like that happened today, even if they got to 10%. How would the United States government afford to pay the interest on the national debt? Back in 1980, the debt was financed with 30-year bonds. Today, the debt is financed with T-bills. The United States made the same mistake as subprime mortgage borrowers. We refinanced our fixed-rate national debt for an arm. And if interest rates go up, it doesn't just affect the money we borrow now, it affects all the money we've been borrowing for years as that debt has to be rolled over. And if people think they have problems now paying their debts, imagine with 10% interest rates. Do you think any financial institution would be solvent with 10% interest rates? I mean, Goldman Sachs makes a big deal that they paid back the TARP money. You think they'd be solvent if they had to deal with a real interest rate, if they didn't get all this free money from their buddies at the Federal Reserve? If the Federal Reserve had to defend the dollar with real interest rates, could Goldman Sachs, could J.P. Morgan, could anybody stay in business with those loan portfolios, with all that leverage? Absolutely not. What would happen to home prices if mortgages were double-digit? Right? I mean, so is the government going to administer all of that tough medicine? Well, they're going to have to avoid massive inflation or hyperinflation. They're going to have to do it. And the problem is, if they won't administer that medicine today, why should we believe they'll do it in the future when it's going to taste a whole lot worse? So there is a real risk that this is going to happen. And this has dramatic implications on us as Americans, as us as investors. Because as this situation gets worse, right, the economy, if you think the economy is bad now, right, wait a few more years, we are just getting started, right? This is the overture. We haven't even heard the opera. There is no fat lady even in the theater at this point. It is going to get a lot worse, and we're going to lose a lot more of our freedoms because the government, every time they make this situation worse, they claim that the solution is more government. It's always more government. It's always that the stimulus wasn't big enough. We just need more of it. Or, oh, the problems were worse than we thought because of too much capitalism. We just need even more government. We just need more central planning. And then we'll solve all the problems. And, of course, as the problems get worse, and ultimately a lot of the temporary forces that have been keeping consumer prices down are overwhelmed by the inflationary forces that are going to cause them to go through the roof, how is our government likely to react to surging food prices and surging energy prices? My guess is price controls. What's that going to do to the country? How's it going to be when there's shortages of basic necessities? What's going to happen when people are buying things on the black market using who knows what? And in addition to losing our economic freedoms, people are going to lose, their financial freedom because they're going to lose any plans they had of retirement. When Barack Obama talks about the fact that his massive government expansion isn't going to cost average Americans anything, it's only going to be paid for by the rich, that's all a sham. They're not raising taxes on the rich nearly enough. In fact, they're barely raising them on the rich. And in fact, there's not as many rich people left to tax. And the more they tax them, the fewer there's going to be. But the problem is you have this huge growth of government. It has to be paid for.